Today we're going to do a walk around of this aircraft, which is a 1952 Piper Tri-Pacer. Reason why we're going to do a walk around, because it's not like a car. If you have trouble when you're off the ground, you don't just pull over. You got to make sure that the basics are sound and secure, because you don't really get much of a second chance. What we're doing here now could make the difference between an uneventful flight or something that you might remember for a long, long time, or worse. Any case, you're going to start to walk around just by having a general overview of the airplane. Just make sure the airplane is sitting properly, make sure the shape of the airplane is correct, you got nothing sagging, nothing bent, nothing out of place. You'll also be able to tell if your tires are slack, because the airplane will lean to whatever side, or if your landing gear is damaged in any way. The airplane should be sitting properly, should look nice and trim and even, nothing distorted. So that's your very first step as you're approaching the aircraft. What I like to do next is get rid of the covers to keep the birds out of the airplane. So I'm just going to go through this as I do it if we were really going flying. We'll lay those aside. Now from there, no matter what aircraft you got, you'll know your own aircraft, hopefully really well. This is our aircraft, so I know this one pretty well, and we do the same thing. It's kind of a routine, and that's what you want when you're doing your walk around. You don't want people bothering you. Just tell your passengers to go over and sit down and just look at what you're doing from afar, so they're not interrupting you, so you don't miss anything. Because basically, you're using the airplane almost as a checklist. I know what goes after what when I'm checking it over. If somebody interrupts you, just take a step back and go back a couple of steps on your walk around so you don't miss anything. Initially, we're going to open the door. We're going to turn the fuel on to the right tank, which is right here. And that's going to set us up to get some fuel in the lines so we can check, make sure we got no leaks, and also so we can sump the two gascolators that are down below properly, because if that's not on, then you're not going to have any gas to them. If you have an electrical system in your plane that shows fuel quantity, or if you're night flying and you need to check your landing lights, that type of thing, now is the time to do that too. You turn your master switch on, you check your fuel gauges, make sure that they're working, and you'd make sure that your lights are functioning. So from here, we'll do our fuel check of our tanks first, which no matter what you think, you got to know every flight how much fuel you got. You fill up the plane after flying, so it should be very full. And this, if you can touch with your finger, you know you got lots, but and anything less than a full, we use our dipstick here. Put it down till it hits bottom, seal it off your finger, and just see what you got. And we're showing over 60 liters in that tank, which is maximum capacity, so we know that one's full. Another good thing is, even if you think it's full, the gas guy is the last guy who put that cap on, so you want to make sure that cap doesn't come off, because if that cap comes off, you'll lose all your gas out of that tank pretty quickly. And we'll do the same thing on the other side. And this airplane only has two tanks, and you can see this one is full right to the top, so we're good there. We got over 60 liters in this one as well. So once we've determined that we got fuel, now we'll start looking at the details of this. I'm just going to go in a counterclockwise direction around the aircraft and just go over what we do one step at a time, the way I do it. So first thing, we'll sump this tank. Take enough to make sure if there's any dirt or any water here, you'll get it. You'll see water in the bottom, small amounts of water, look like little green peas kind of floating in the bottom, about that size, little blobs. But I usually smell it just to make sure it is indeed not all water, and make sure that it's not jet fuel or something. It smells good. And then if you had any doubt when you pour this out onto the pavement, if it's water, it'll bead. If it's fuel, it'll just dissipate right into the pavement. From there, we check all our basics. We check our flap pins and the cotter pins that locate them, the linkage pins for the actuator for the flaps. Same thing right here. You definitely do not want one of these pins to come out while you're flying. It'd really make an interesting experience. Same thing with your aileron. Make sure your cotter pins are in. Make sure your nylock nuts are tight and the thread is exposed on the outside when you're not backing off. Turn down your aileron. You look up top and you see the cotter pin is there. The cable looks great. And the aileron has no slop. No slop in the linkage. Everything is working as it should there. Same for this one out here. Now we'll go to these bolts here, which are critical. The rear spar attach bolt and the front spar attach bolt. Both of which are definitely very important. Make sure that they're tight. Make sure that there's no sign of any loose hardware or missing hardware. And check where these come through the fabric. Make sure that there's no distress on the fabric or anything. Make sure that these are not cracked. There are the metal brackets that attach this fitting to the actual spar. The same thing on the rear. As we come down here, we'll give the lock nuts a check on the bottom of the strut adjusters. The two nuts and bolts that hold the rod ends on the bottom to the actual airframe. Again, very critical piece of hardware, some of the most critical hardware in the aircraft. And the other thing to understand is the aircraft that most of us are flying are either home built or they're older. Very few people got an aircraft less than 10 years old. So this stuff has been flying for 64 years right now. So you really want to have a look at the fittings here, make sure there's no sign of any cracks, make sure there's no deformation, no wrinkles in the fabric anywhere. Make sure that nothing inside the structure looks like it's broken. And from here you'd go your landing gear, some of the fittings that get the most abuse on the airplane. Make sure there's no cracks there, make sure the hardware is tight. Come down to your brake, you don't see any leakage here, you don't see anything wet, and your hardware is tight holding your brake on. And same thing with your wheel, your tire pressure, you can judge by how much sag is in the bottom of the tire. Make sure that's good, and also you have a quick look over the tires, make sure that there's nothing that stands out in your mind as being a big split or a cut or anything like that that might cause you grief. And especially if you had a hard landing last time. Okay, from here on this aircraft, there's a low point drain right here because the fuel lines from this wing come down around the door, front and back, and they come down to a low point gasculator right here. The same thing, you'll take a decent sized sample from that, you'll make sure there's no water, no dirt, make sure it smells like fuel, and that looks really good. And more important if your airplane is not flown a lot, because you'll get more condensation, you'll get more crud building up in it than if it's flown regularly. From there, we'll open the cowl, and as we're going, we can look, make sure our hardware is in place. Pipers are notorious for the sheet metal screws backing out, but we'll make sure that they're in decent shape as we're going. In here, looking at your engine, there's a few things I always check. First one being the oil level. In this airplane, you want between 6 and 8 quarts showing. So we're right there. We got 7, which is excellent. The oil color looks decent, and it should be because it's only been changed about 8 to 10 flight hours ago. Look at your hoses. Make sure they're still attached. Make sure they're not bust open anywhere. Make sure your magneto on this side is not loose. Cotter pin that holds the engine bolt, engine nut on the engine bolt. Another one here. And there's another down here that holds the engine mount to the firewall. And the same up here. The bolt that holds your landing gear to your engine mount. Make sure that's good and cothered. Your oil pressure sender, make sure that's not falling out of place. It'll give you some strange readings if that gets loose. Your hose that feeds your oil pressure unit, make sure it's not leaking or split. And then in on back here, you got your wiring harness for your P leads on your magnetos and your oil temperature probe. They all look good, nothing frayed, nothing out of place, and zip tied, nice and firm. You don't want any of this stuff moving around very much. And your exhaust system, grab onto it, make sure it's not loose from the engine. Make sure your tailpipe is tight. I just check spark plugs always, just to make sure that none of those are backing out. And I usually check these nuts that hold the exhaust manifold and the intake manifolds to the cylinders, just make sure they're not backing off. Primer lines, delicate little copper line, make sure that's not cracked. Make sure you don't see any wetness on it. From there, we can look in under here. We can grab the carb heat box, the air intake, just make sure it's not loose, because I've seen those crack before. And I've also seen the carburetors come loose from the engine, which give you a massive air leak and affect your performance drastically till the carburetor completely separates, which wouldn't be good. And in through here, if you look closely, you can see the linkages and the cables where the mixture and the throttle are actually operated, and the carb heat door is operated on the bottom of the engine on the carburetor shroud. And you can have a look in there and make sure that they look like they're in place, because again, you don't want that stuff loosening up. You'll lose your throttle control or your mixture control, and you could end up with a pretty bad experience from that. As well, make sure you don't see anything dripping out of the, you'll always get a little bit of oil leak, but make sure you don't see anything dripping or running out of the cowling. Make sure you relatch it as soon as you close it up, because if you forget to latch it, it'll come open when you're flying and it won't be a good day. From there, we'll look into here. The fan belt, or sorry, the alternator belt is right here. Make sure the tension is proper on it and the condition is decent. You can also grab hold of your propeller, make sure you got nothing loose there. Make sure your screws are tight holding your spinner on. And these propellers are susceptible to damage on the leading edges. Make sure that you got no nicks, scratches, gouges on that, on the leading edges. Because they could develop into cracks if you're not careful. So you want to have a good look at that every time. Again, this aircraft has an oil cooler which is blocked off currently, but you want to make sure the lines going to that are in decent shape and there's no leakage there, because 75 pounds of oil pressure on these engines, and if they start to leak because of a cracked line, they'll pump the oil out pretty quickly. So you want to make sure right here you don't have any big amount of oil leaking out. Now go to this side. Make sure the Venturi screws are all there. Make sure that's solid. And we'll basically check the same thing. We'll check spark plug tightness. We'll check the nuts on the manifolds. We'll check primer lines. Oil drain back tubes. Grab the exhaust, make sure it's nothing cracked, nothing loose. Have a look in here. Actually, this is a modification we did because we found that if the exhaust started to leak here, it could really put a lot of heat on this primer line, and if that burned through, then you'd have an unending flow of fuel out of it because that's fed from the gascolator. So there's always about 1 to 2 pounds of fuel pressure from the gravity feed system. So you'd lose all your fuel eventually, but of course you don't want fuel running down all over your exhaust in the back of your engine. Same thing here. You got the nuts holding the engine to the mount, and the nuts holding the engine mount to the plane. Your landing gear mount, cothered. Magneto is tight. Oil filter housing, no sign of any leakage there, and wiring nice, clean, tidy, nothing chafing, nothing rubbing. And your primer line where it comes through the firewall, which is a very likely spot to have it chafe. The rubber tube that it goes through there is fine, and the primer line that feeds back into the primer is fine as well. And from here we can also see our fuel line right here that feeds the carburetor from the gascolator. So the gas is turned on earlier, so there's fuel pressure there now. I don't see any sign of any leaking, I don't see anything weeping, so we know that our connection from our gascolator to our carburetor is in decent shape. Again, this is where you don't want someone to interrupt you, because you might forget to latch your cowl, and then, like I say, wouldn't be good. As we come down here, check the landing gear, make sure that all the nylock nuts are in place, make sure all the bolts that mount the fork to the strut are there, make sure we have no huge amount of oil coming out of the strut. You'll always get a little bit of oil on the strut on this airplane, just various drips and that coming down from the crankcase of the engine, and over time just making it wet. Make sure you got your chrome showing. On this aircraft, you should have about 4 fingers of chrome when the airplane is at rest. Make sure the nut's holding the wheel to the fork. Got some thread showing on the outside of them. Make sure they're not after backing off. Make sure there's no sign of the wheel rubbing on the fork if the bearings get bad or if something loosens up. It's a sign that you got trouble. And down here is your main gasculator. You'll take a sample out of that. And again, you'll look, make sure that there's no dirt, no water, and make sure it is indeed fuel, and it is. Now we'll start on this assembly here, same as the other side. Make sure these are tight. Make sure these are tight and cothered. Make sure that your fitting on your airframe is not showing any signs of fatigue or cracking. Make sure your landing gear hardware and your landing gear forks, where they mount onto the airplane, are in good shape. And they are. Make sure the hardware holding the door hinge in place is okay. From there, we'll work our way out the wing. So same thing here, flap hardware in decent shape. Everything is there. Same thing with this one. Pitot and static tube. Make sure it's not plugged up here. Make sure the static ports are open. Make sure it's not ready to break off. Looks great. Come out here to the aileron. Aileron hardware. Aileron cable connections, really good. Aileron hardware there is fine. No binding, no stiffness, and no slop. And also now the bolts that hold the struts to the wings, good shape, the bracket is good. Same thing right here. And on this wing we also got the landing light lens. We'll make sure that's in decent shape, not ready to crack open and let all kinds of air into the inside of our wing, which probably would put the fabric to the test for sure. Now, we'll come back in here, we'll sump this gas tank. So there's 4 sump locations on this airplane altogether. There's no excuse to have dirt or water in your fuel with this many low points, and that looks good. From here, our brake hardware, make sure there's no leaking, make sure there's nothing missing there, make sure it's tight. And the tire pressure looks great. For the most part, that's the part that takes the longest is what we've just done. The rest of it, the tail, doesn't take very long because a lot of the tail hardware is internal. You check it at your annual, and you don't get to check it without taking off inspection covers, which we're not going to do on a pre-flight. So we'll just check the basics. We make sure that the nut that holds the leading edge of the stabilizer to the jack screw piece is in place. We'll look in through here as best we can. And we'll have a look at some of the cables that we can see where they go around the pulleys. Make sure there's no chafing or fraying. Make sure the jack screw looks nice and greasy, which it does. You might be able to get a shot in there. And then from here, we'll check our tail brace wires. Make sure each one is safetied at all the mount locations. So you got several fittings and several cotter pins going through several clevis pins to hold this whole system together. And it is critical. Without these tail brace wires, the fin and the stabilizers don't have very much strength. These anchor everything together and give you some triangulation and tie it into the bottom of the fuselage, and it's what gives the tail its strength. If it fails, you could end up with a catastrophic failure of the tail, especially if you're in rough air or if you're maneuvering the thing hard. Same thing you'll check here, cotter pins. Everything is good. The fittings where they anchor onto the fuselage are in good shape. So from there, we'll check the rest of the hardware that holds the elevator end of the stabilizer to the pivot. We'll come down here, check our rudder hinge pins. There's only 2 rudder hinge pins. That one is cothered, and that one up there is cothered. I can see it. The fittings are in good shape. And the rudder cable and the adjuster, all cothered. Ends of the cable looks good. Same on this side. Cable tension is okay. And from here, the 2 pins holding the elevator. That one is cothered, and that one is cothered. We'll check on this side, and that one is cothered, and so is that one. So that puts that much of it to rest. And now the only thing we'll do is check this bolt here. Fine. And we'll have another look in through the tail on this side and see if there's anything else that we can see. Loose hardware, or missing hardware, or frayed wires. It all looks really good. So now the next thing to do is bring the plane outside, And the rest of the pre-flight is your actual pre-flight checklist that you do every time when you start the engine up. You'll check your oil pressure, you'll check your alternator, check your carb heat function, check your magnetos, and that's on the checklist. And so that's not really part of the walk around. But between what we just did and the pre-start checklist, you should catch anything that's going to put you in jeopardy mechanically. And the only other thing some people might include with the pre-flight is making sure all the documents are on board the plane. That's not really my intention here to cover that part of it, but needless to say, it's good to make sure you got your proof of insurance, your pilot's license, your certificate of airworthiness, your radio documents, everything on board the plane with you. And other than that, that'd be pretty much concluded. There might be some different things for your aircraft, depending on what you own. But no matter what it is, if it's this or if it's a B-17 bomber, you still want to give it a good look over before you get up there, because once you get up there, everything changes. There's no small problems when you're flying, for sure. Anyway, that pretty much concludes what I had to do here tonight, and hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully it helps you out. And like I say, there's going to be other things with other airplanes, but that's what we do with this one. Thank you.